Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our discussion today on the recently published book, The Kill Chain, Defending America and the Future of High-Tech Warfare. My name is Jude Blanchette. I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS, and I'm really pleased to be joined by the book's author, Chris Brose, who's the head of strategy at Anduril Industries. That title is only the latest of Chris's long list of impressive achievements, including staff director of the Senate Armed Service Committee, senior policy advisor for the late Senator John McCain, policy advisor and chief speechwriter for Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and speechwriter for Secretary of State Colin Powell. Chris and I are about the same age, so that list of accomplishments is particularly annoying to me as I make intersubjective comparisons with all my peer group. But I asked Chris to join us today to discuss his book, but with a particular eye towards China and the People's Liberation Army and where the United States is vis-a-vis military preparedness for a possible conflict with China. Of course, the imperative right now is for the US and China to find a way to manage the frictions and tensions, which seem to be building and growing at an exponential rate. But of course, military planners need to be looking for possibilities that the frictions spill over into a hot conflict. And I think now, while most of the news cycle is focused on the trade war or economic and financial decoupling or competition over technology and talent, we are seeing a proliferation of flashpoints here, South China Sea, Taiwan, on the Korean Peninsula. So I think this is a important, if difficult, discussion that we need to be having, looking out on how the United States military plans over the coming decades. So we're going to talk about China a fair bit today, or at least we're going to talk about how the United States should be positioning itself vis-a-vis China. But I want to start, Chris, with a big softball question, which is just to ask you to lay out for those folks who haven't had a chance to read this really, really great and really, really well-written book, who've not had a chance to read it. What's the main thesis here in The Kill Chain?
Well, thank you, Jude, and thanks for the kind words. Thanks for bringing me on to do this. And the thing that I would also start out is that you yourself have recently published an excellent book, very much focused on China, hugely influential to how I thought about that aspect of the problem that I was writing about. So, highly, highly recommend that to everybody who's watching. Why did I write this book? This was a question that I sort of asked myself every single day that I was doing this. Why on earth did I do this? But, the big reason, I guess, is, I wanted to think through and use this book to try to explain how I thought emerging technologies were going to change the future of military power and military competition. I think there's a lot of discussion right now about technologies such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, autonomous systems, biotech, new space technologies. And, I'm looking at this through the lens of sort of what are the military applications? How are these going to change the way, militaries build forces and operate them? This obviously is occurring in sort of a broader context of strategy with, diplomatic tools of power, economic, our values, other things. And, that's all important. The book is not trying to address that aspect of it. I'm much more focused on how are these technologies going to change the future of warfare and the future of military competition? And I guess to put it simply, the concern that I had as I worked for the better part of a decade in the Senate Armed Services Committee, kind of worked on these issues, inside the defense establishment, inside of our government, was that we were oftentimes thinking about the problem backwards. We thought more around how these technologies could enable us to incrementally improve the military capabilities that we have had and operated for a very long period of time, and sort of do better versions of the things that we have done for a very long period of time. And the bigger concern to me is that I think the kind of ways and means of American military power are being fundamentally disrupted. They're being disrupted by the emergence of great power competitors such as China, and we'll get into that. it's also being disrupted by the emergence of new technologies. And the right way to think about these technologies is, again, not how they will allow us to optimize the things we have and the way we've always used them, but how they will enable us to build totally different and new capabilities, use them and operate them in new ways, organize ourselves in new ways, and ultimately try to solve these military problems in fundamentally different ways. And the kill chain is kind of a concept that I embraced in the writing of it. It's a concept that pretty much everybody inside or who's worked around the United States military is familiar with, but I think most people who aren't. It's essentially a process of what militaries do in competition. They seek to understand their environment, they seek to make decisions, they seek to take actions. And I felt that was an important and sort of helpful framing, because that's ultimately the way to think about how technologies can and should enable us to change the way we operate, build and operate military forces. That process is going to change, or that the tools that we will use, the technologies we will use will change. But that end state of improving and accelerating and scaling human ability to understand, decide, and act into these sort of dangerous, high-pressure military contests, that is pretty much universal. So, in a nutshell, it was really trying to think through, where we are and where we're going.
Chris, can I ask you, for the uninitiated, such as myself, who are new to this this world of sort of defense planning, can you just give an example of a kill chain in action, just so we can understand the sort of the process at work here? I guess would be helpful. Maybe just what's a conventional sort of kill chain, and then can you talk a little bit about, when you're thinking about how the disruptive capabilities of technology, what is an idea of what a kill chain should look like in the future, utilizing AI, quantum, some of these emergent technologies?
Sure. So, for the U.S. military, they will get into very technical detail as to the various different phases of the kill chain. What I'm trying to do, because I'm writing the book for, really for more of a general audience, an informed general audience, I want it to be well received by experts and specialists and people inside of the defense establishment. But I'm really trying to explain these ideas to people who really haven't sort of had to live and work in this environment, because I think that's the only way we're going to change in the way that I think that we have to. So what I'm really trying to do with the kill chain is kind of break it down into those fundamental tasks that militaries have to perform. And really, it's, in my opinion, it's those three. I mean, it's understanding what's happening, it's making decisions, and it's taking actions. So an example would be, if you're operating at a U.S. military base, and that base is now going to face, a significant threat from large quantities of incoming missiles, ballistic missiles or cruise missiles or hypersonic weapons. In order to defend yourself effectively, you have to do all three of those things. You have to understand what's happening, which in specific terms will mean, where are all of those very fast moving objects in real time? How can I, not just identify where they are and what those threats are, but actively track them so that a human being can make a decision about how to defend themselves, how to defend their installation, and then ultimately have the means of doing that. So, missile defense, or a directed energy weapon, or some new different kind of capability or mixture of capabilities. And the benefit of these technologies, such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, more and more machine autonomy, is not that they're going to replace human beings in the conduct of war. It's that they're going to enable human beings to make better use of the information that they have, to more rapidly generate insights about, where are those threats to me at any given time, enable them faster to make better decisions, higher quality decisions, more rapid decisions, do it over and over and over again, and then ultimately direct actions. That process of acceleration from understanding, decision, action, what the U.S. military refers to as closing the kill chain, I think that's where these technologies will really show their benefit. Again, it's not taking the human being out of that process. It's enabling the human being to focus on the things that we need them to focus on, which is, operational and strategic and ethical decision making, and really rely on higher and higher quality, more intelligent, more autonomous systems and processes to make better use of the information that they have, to make better decisions faster, and ultimately take better, more relevant actions with fewer mistakes to defend themselves or succeed in military missions and operations that the nations ask them to perform.
Cognizant, we've got sort of 19 minutes left, so I'm going to make very awkward transitions between one topic and the other. I want to sort of take what you've just discussed and now map this onto an issue of extreme importance now, both in terms of the current U.S. political discussion, but has been at the center, at least for how the defense establishment has been thinking about some of our long-term threats for quite a while now, which is the rise of China, and especially the military rise of China. Again, for the uninitiated, such as myself, I think there was a widespread belief that U.S. military power was predominant and really didn't face a peer challenger. And one of the things that surprised me earlier on in the book is you talked about how, and I'll give you a chance to phrase it better than I would, but what we think just ain't so, and that in fact the United States really, despite extraordinary amounts of spending, the fact that we have advanced weapon systems, combat experience which is incomparable, especially with regards to China, which hasn't been in military conflict since 1979, that actually the lead we have is not as great as many of us would think. And in fact, I think you argue that we're in some ways at a deficit. So how would you sort of describe where we are now vis-a-vis competition with China in terms of our military preparedness?
Yeah, I think the problem is that for 25 to 30 years, the Chinese military has gone to school on the United States. Really, since the first Gulf War, they have looked at how the United States builds forces and operates them, the underlying assumptions that we make about the ability to, operate from forward positions of sanctuary, to have time on our side, to have technological superiority and overmatch. And the Chinese military has systematically not tried to play the same game that the United States has played, but to play a different game, to build different kinds of military forces, to call into question the types of capabilities we have, how we use them, and really to kind of undermine the assumptions on which the United States military projects power. This has been a systematic and methodical effort for a very long period of time. This was not a hurricane that sort of hit us one day. It's been playing out kind of right in front of us for a very long time. And I think that's been part of the challenge is, it's the proverbial frog in the pot problem. And I think if you look at how their military modernization has progressed, they've progressed a lot further than most Americans realize. They have built up large quantities of weapons to go after our sources of advantage. So, long-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, hypersonic weapons to attack our forward military bases in the Asia-Pacific region. Long-range reconnaissance satellites and over-the-horizon radar and other sensors to identify the carrier and the carrier battle group. Dense networks of integrated air defense systems to deny our military aircraft, access and the ability to penetrate into their areas. And then increasingly sort of a suite of capabilities around the doctrine that they refer to as systems destruction warfare, really going after the way the United States builds battle networks, operates them in combat, the way we move information, rely upon space for critical communications and intelligence, position, navigation, and timing. All of these advantages that we have taken for granted for a very long time, the Chinese military has methodically built up capabilities to counter, to deny us access to the sources of advantage that we've had, the way we have planned to operate in combat. None of this is to suggest that China's 10 feet tall or that the United States doesn't have means of effectively responding. We do. It's the broader concern that they've made a lot more progress than most Americans realize, including many Americans in the Congress, who are in positions to know. And it's the broader concern of the trajectory that they're now on. The thing about China is that their intentions remain, still somewhat unclear as to how they're going to use all of this power that they are amassing as they rise politically, economically, militarily. the capabilities that they're building up, however, I think call into question many of the assumptions that the United States has long planned to sort of build forces and operate forces upon. And I think it is something that is again, it's been sort of a long disruption to the ways in which we have planned to operate our forces, and I think it now calls into question many of the ends, ways, and means of U.S. defense strategy.
I think building on your experience up on the Hill, what you just said just jogged my memory of something I was thinking about yesterday when I was thinking about the questions I wanted to ask you, which is the framing for thinking about military competition with China. We obviously think first about the U.S. military and DoD, but of course our military is under civilian control, with Congress approving the budget for it, and with civilian command and the president being commander in chief, which of course is structurally quite different, or organizationally quite different, than the People's Liberation Army, which both swears the loyalty to the Communist Party of China, so it's not a national army, and of course doesn't have to go through the same process for budget approval and for oversight. I have a question about political preparedness to be able to support military preparedness in the United States. And you just mentioned maybe a lack of awareness on just how advanced or how much progress the Chinese military has made amongst some folks up on the Hill. Can you talk for just a bit about, is our political system advanced enough or organized enough to be able to be thinking about some of these longer term challenges, especially in light of the connection between Congress and military preparedness in both in terms of the budget and other areas of oversight? Or do we have some problems there as well?
Yeah, that to me is the sort of the source of greatest concern that I have about the future that we're moving into. When you look structurally at the United States, we have remarkable advantages. We have amazing technology and world-leading companies that are building it. We have remarkable people, critical thinking, entrepreneurial people, both in government and outside of it. We have a lot of money, both in the government. Still, I think, in light of current events, still a lot of money being spent on defense and national security, and then orders of magnitude more in the private sector. All of these are great sources of strength and advantage. The challenge is the one you mentioned, which is kind of the imagination and resolve and sense of urgency inside of our political system to get after this problem, with the sort of urgency that it requires. That's where I think we've fallen short, and that's where I think that we still have a lot of room to improve. Things have changed. The debate about China is very different than the one that I remember on the Hill, 4, 5, 6 years ago, to say nothing of further back. That debate is starting to turn, and the kinds of things we're talking about, I think, are more recognized by members of Congress. They understand that. There is a real great power competition here, and starting to think through the implications of that is something that many members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, I think, are beginning to engage in. I think the challenge is, our military is built in, what my old boss, John McCain, used to refer to the military-industrial congressional complex. I don't use that pejoratively. I mean, that is the nature of how military programs are developed and built in a democracy. You have stakeholders in the DoD, the Congress, industry, others, and it makes it very difficult to change. Not impossible, but very difficult to change. And the single biggest thing that I think we have lacked in the past that I think we need to develop now, is a sense, sort of the ability to imagine that there are things worse than changing. Change is hard. It's going to require hard choices and trade-offs, and there are going to be winners and losers. The only way that we are going to make those kinds of changes is if our political system, both in the executive and legislative branches, as well as people outside of government, truly believe and appreciate in a visceral sense that the consequences of not changing are worse than the consequences of changing. That we could actually lose conventional deterrence, that we could actually lose a war. That, I think, those are the stakes of this competition. Those are the stakes that we're dealing with right now. And I think we have to put the decisions that we're going to have to make to change the U.S. military, what to invest in, what to divest from, in that context, so that we can truly appreciate the urgency that I think we're going to have to move with to solve these problems.
Yeah, and just your comment about China not being 10 feet tall. It's another thing that I notice about the shift in political discussion is seems like the United States has a very hard time of splitting the difference, or what some would call nuance. We sort of lurch between extreme poles of what threats either are completely non-existent or now, volume turned up to 11.
Yeah.
And one of the things I notice about the shift on China now is it is verging towards the China 10 foot tall scenario. And that worries me for a couple reasons. One is I'm not sure we realize just how the side effects or the knock-on effects of such a narrative, because especially for countries around the world, if we start talking about China as 10 feet tall, that creates an impression of inevitability,
right,
and extreme superiority of China's rise, right? And of course, I think what we're saying is China's 6'9", right? So it's tall enough that you want to take it very seriously,
right.
But it's something that is a manageable challenge, right? And the second is, concern I have is just if we are painting a picture of China as 10 feet tall, it strikes me it's going to be very hard for us to have an accurate calibration of exactly what we need to be to responding to that challenge, right? We're likely to overspend in some areas, underspend in others. I'm not sure that this problem is soluble in open democratic systems where we have a multiplicity of voices and political incentives that seem to steer discussions towards extremes. But nonetheless, this seems like a new emergent challenge we have with getting the China conversation right, is getting that 6'9", or pick your height, 7'2". I'm not sure what it is.
Right.
But we seem to have lurched from not even knowing there was such a thing as a communist party 5 years ago to now the Communist Party is an existential threat. And anyway, that's a longer conversation for another day. But
well, and if I could just build on that, I mean, I think you're exactly right. And what I try to do in the book is explain sort of realistically where I think we are, how we measure up, but then also to give people the sense that, look, all hope is not lost here. In my opinion, U.S. military primacy is disappearing. What we have enjoyed for the past sort of 3 decades, that sort of position of unipolarity, military primacy, that is eroding and going away. The kind of position of military dominance that we've had is eroding. But nobody should be fatalistic about what that's going to mean. I think we just need to be realistic to say, if we begin to change, what our ends are, what our ways of military competition, the way we build forces, I do believe, as I say in the book, that we can achieve, kind of defense without dominance. Even though, we're moving into a world where if China continues on the trajectory that it's on, we won't have that position of dominance, military dominance that we once did. If we do things differently, we can still nonetheless defend the core interests of the United States, the people, places, and things in the world that matter most to us. It's going to look different than the world we've been living in for 30 years since the end of the Cold War. But I'd argue that world has been pretty aberrational. And what we're moving into is something more like the historical norm, where you do have great power competition. You do have peer and near peer competitors. That's going to require us to think differently. Before we even get into the questions of what we're spending and what we're buying, how we're operating forces, it's that thinking question that we've got to get right. And I do believe that if we change the sort of ends, ways, and means of our defense strategy, we can absolutely be successful in this world, but it's just going to look different than the world we've been living in.
So I think building on that, the first part of your book, I think, is a really good diagnosis, which is as much as kind of an epistemological critique of the way that we conceptualize and respond to sort of threats or even sort of our own ambitions and goals that we have, and saying that we're kind of prioritizing platforms over processes. I think getting to the prognosis part. So can you lay out, and I realize we've only got a few minutes, so it's a bit unfair to ask you to do this against the back of the session here, but what is the path forward? And I think from your own vantage point, what are the steps that we should be taking, whether those are cognitive or procedural, to be able to shift the discussion or shift this back in a way that we can be responding to or deterring China's rise where it is problematic?
Yeah. I think the big problem that we've had is that we've been dominant for so long that we've come to believe and assume that the tools that have delivered us that dominance will forever be the tools that, that we can rely upon. And, a lot of the ways that we think about building military power really kind of revolves around those platforms that have generated the dominance that we've long enjoyed. Traditional aircraft and ships and vehicles, and satellites and the like. And we too often think about modernization in the sense of making better and better versions of the things that we've always had. So at a conceptual level, and again, the reason I focus on the kill chain is that's actually the end state that we're trying to get to. That is the sort of benchmark that we're trying to achieve, is how we work through that process of understanding, deciding, and acting faster at greater scale, more accurately, more efficiently. The tools that are going to deliver that are I'm not actually sure, that they're actually clear right now. And I think that's, again, sort of the sense that we need to be a bit humbler than we've been about our ability to predict the future and know exactly where we're going, exactly the kinds of tools and military capabilities we're going to need to get there. All too often, our defense establishment tries to define requirements for military power, out to 2025, 2030, 2035. On any given day, I have no idea what's going to happen next week, let alone a decade from now. We can't think that way anymore. We have to be much humbler about focusing on the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, which is, superior understanding, decision-making, and action. And then put in place processes where we can much more iteratively, experimentally, kind of feel our way to where we need to go and know what we are baselining against year after year. What are the metrics and outcomes we're trying to achieve? How do we get faster? How do we do it at greater scale? How do we do it more dynamically? And I think that also begins to put the technologies into perspective. Some of those solutions are going to be brand new technologies. Some will be mixtures of old and new technologies. Some will be old technologies used in completely new and different ways. It really shouldn't matter, because ultimately it's that outcome, that end state that we're trying to achieve. And I think a lot of the ways that our defense establishment works are going to have to change to incentivize that kind of behavior, to be more flexible about how we use money year over year, holding some of that aside for these kinds of real world experiments and exercises where we can take things out and really figure out what is working best now to drive resourcing decisions that we want to make that year and the next year. And then figure out, how we scale things that are really high potential. Too often the problem in the defense establishment has been that we have interesting new entrants or new technologies, but they all sort of die in that proverbial valley of death and never get to the other side where they can scale into, larger military capabilities, programs of record. I think if we get that underlying process right, of getting the problems defined correctly, setting up processes that allow us to experiment and sort of feel our way to the right answers, focusing on outcomes rather than inputs, I think we can begin to get a clear idea of the investments we need to make at greater scale in sort of new capabilities and ramping that up fast, as well as the divestments that we're going to have to make in terms of either new technologies that aren't proving out or legacy systems that are increasingly being overtaken by events. It's got to be more data driven. It's got to be more real world baselined. And I think that it's, for me, more about getting those processes right, because I'm not here to tell you that I know exactly what the world is going to look like, a year, 5, 10 years down the road. And I think, that's all too often been our problem, is, we've sort of been spoiled by the position of dominance that we've had, and sort of have too often hubristically been too confident in our ability to predict the future.
Great closing statement, Chris, and very punctual. Brings us right to half past the hour. So I want to thank you very much for this time. Highly recommend everyone read the book, "The Kill Chain: Defending America in the Future of High-Tech Warfare." Comrade Brose, thank you very much, and hope we can have discussions of similar quality in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jude. I appreciate it.
All right. See you, my friend.
See you.
Bye.